webinars. I am Mamutando Ntakomwa, a writing fellow and communications assistant with African Liberty. And today I'm joined by two guests, Vincent Kumwenda, who is from Malawi. He is the CEO of MHub, which is Malawi's first ever tech and innovation hub, as well as Malawi's leading tech and innovation hub. So they've been committed to using tech to address social issues and mobilize youth for change and economic development. And Vincent has mentioned that he's quite passionate about the topic for today, which is internet shutdowns in Africa. So again, Vincent, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tando.
Great. And we're also joined by Abiba Ivy Princewell. So she is a Nigerian lawyer, a gender equality and free market advocate as well. And she is also a fellow with African Liberty. She writes primarily on issues to do with rule of law and economic freedom. And if you're looking to read some of her work, it's available in Daily Maverick essay. She's been featured there, as well as the Breaking Times in Nigeria. So thank you, Abiba, for making the time to be here.
Thank you, Tendo. Thank you.
All right, great. So our topic today is internet shutdowns in Africa. We have about 20 minutes to discuss this. We've cut our webinars quite short, actually. They used to be much, much longer. But yeah, so we're looking at internet shutdowns in Africa, especially over the last year during the pandemic. It has been noted that it's becoming more and more a common trend for some African countries for the governments to sometimes shut down or restrict the access to social media, and in turn silencing the voice of many citizens. And this has been a rising issue of concern, especially as we look at freedoms and democracy and the liberties of African citizens and access to information. And so I guess to start us off, I would ask you, Abiba, as you have also done, I believe, some writing on the rule of law and democracy and so on, what the correlation between democracy and access to the internet is.
I think a good starting point is to remind ourselves about what democracy is. And I think increasingly on the African continent, people think that democracy is just about elections. So elections, of course, are an important aspect of democracy, but fundamentally it's about the ability of citizens to be informed and to make informed choices and for their choices to matter in the decision-making process. And traditionally, the way people got informed was through schools, through newspapers, through the radio, through television. But increasingly, the internet has become a very important media for people to get information, to make informed decisions about how they want their society to be organized, either politically or economically. So of course, there is a correlation between the strength of your democracy and access to the internet, because the internet is a tool to build information. But at the same time, that correlation can sometimes be positive and can sometimes be negative. So at the moment, we're all very concerned about the positive relationship between democracy and access to the internet, which is if you have high access to the internet, unrestricted access to the internet, the citizens are better informed. But at the same time, we also have to be careful that those who want to subvert democracy also have a very powerful tool with the internet. So if before a dictator wanted to go after activists, all he had to do was to send the secret service to go after you at home, at school, at your workplace. But now, if you're an activist and you have a very powerful online presence, they could use a surveillance system and track your location depending on the post you put on Facebook, on Instagram, or on LinkedIn. So increasingly, we are beginning to see the second wave of correlation between democracy and access to the internet, in the sense that those who want to subvert democracy can also use the internet to find those who want to protect democracy much more quickly than they otherwise would have. So that's another trend we're beginning to see on the African continent. And then the third correlation I wanted us to mention and highlight at the moment, that we're beginning to see many mature democracies, but African countries should beware because that could also be happening, is the internet being used as a weapon of disinformation, either by the government against its own citizens or by foreign actors who want to interfere in the activities of the internal affairs of the country. So historically, Africa has always been a playground for world powers, right? So the have like proxy wars using different rebel groups. But now, if a country wants to undermine another country, you can do that using the internet. So for us in Africa, we need to maximize the benefits of the internet in terms of democratizing information while we minimize the risk of authoritarian regimes using the internet as a tool to go after political opponents, and also authoritarian regimes using the internet as a way to spread disinformation across the population group so that they're able to like use propaganda to make people act in a certain kind of way. So for me, that relationship between democracy and access to the internet is a complicated one increasingly. But in Africa, we shouldn't lose sight of the strengths, but we should also not lose sight of the potential for those who want to subvert democracy to use those same strengths of the internet against the vast majority of their citizens. So that's what I wanted to put out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abiba. You've actually brought out some interesting points. I like what you have brought out in terms of protection, being protected from authoritarian regimes and so on. And Vincent, I believe I did mention, I think in an email not too long ago, that I did read something you had written about how we can protect ourselves from abuses by government in this way. And I was wondering if you could chime in as well on that, just in terms of protection from authoritarian regimes and so on, when we talk about internet shutdowns.
Interesting. I think just to add on what Abiba started with, it's interesting if you read a report by the Freedom House, I think from around 2019, if you look at the correlation between internet and democracy, the report says that from 2005, there's been a decrease in terms of the democracy scores across the world. So whilst we're celebrating the advent of internet, the rise of internet, but what's the impact like on the ground? Are we really gaining in terms of democracy? Because as Abiba is putting it, we have easy access to information, there's knowledge sharing, a lot of political knowledge these days. And if you see a lot of protests that have been happening in Africa, even across the world, you can attribute some of those to the internet. And at the same time, governments are using the internet in terms of maybe tracking down political activists, persecuting dissidents, and even spreading foreign propaganda on social media and different platforms. So the issue is mostly just to balance up. How can we still enjoy the internet, use it to advance democracy, but take cognizance of the things that are also happening on the ground. For instance, a number of countries that are now becoming democratic countries is probably decreasing now. Free states and even partly free states are decreasing. So it's something that we need to take a lot of effort legally, but also as activists in different ways to support different citizens, how best they can use the internet to stand up for their rights and even contribute a little bit more to democracy.
And I know with the EndSARS movement, internet played a very huge role with that and just getting that out there. And a lot of people worldwide were using the internet to raise awareness about what was happening in Nigeria. So in under 2 minutes, could you share, I guess, based on that, what you saw in terms of democracy and just that, how the internet assisted as you guys were going through this EndSARS movement?
For me, I feel that the internet is the most important tool for promoting democracy that has ever been developed, because for the past few years, it has continued to defy control and regulation, except for recent times. The thing is, it indirectly impacts the democratic process by influencing participation in political processes such as voting, especially for countries that have the largest voting blocks, which are the youths. You know, it encourages them to participate without having to go out of their homes, without having to resort to the local and formal medias. And secondly, you know, the youth, like I said, they're better and informed voting population. So this use of internet, use of social media networks, communication networks has better provided them access to information. It's unlike them having to wait for the 7 p.m. news before they could get to know what's happening. It's unlike having for them to have to buy a newspaper for them to know what is going on. Now they can check their phones and see, okay, this is what is going on. The use of internet is surpassing traditional print, surpassing broadcast media outlets as the primary information source before. And now, we have, you could get information literally at your fingertips. And it's influencing political participation of citizens to influence the structure of government. And the answer is definitely yes. There's a correlation between the internet and democracy because it expands your capability of information sharing. Now for the NSAS movement, I mean, for recent times, it's like the best example you could use because we managed to move the protest from online to the streets. I mean, it was like magic, but yes, it works. You could literally start a movement online, and before you know it, it spills to the streets because now the internet has provided we youths the ability to communicate and share our opinions directly. Ignoring socio-economic, gender, religious, ethnic, national differences, which improves democratic participation. So it is easy to tell people, you know what, this is what we need to do at this time of the protest, and you see the result on the streets because they have this information at the tips of their hands. They do not have to wait for the traditional media that could have edited so many parts out because they do not want to offend the government, or they do not want to say something that would, lead to a crackdown on them. So they have this access to free information, meeting points, what to do, what to bring, what are we going to be doing at the protest ground right now, what is the hashtag for today, what is our focus right now. You do not have to. Now it led also
to just stop you there. Sorry. Sorry, we're a little bit time sensitive today, but I just love the fact that we can really see the example of just how the internet aided democracy, and it's so recent. So really, thank you for just bringing that out, as well as just being able to hear it from you, who was there and part of this. It's like magic, like you said. Yeah, so I guess another thing that I wanted us to chat. Sorry, another thing I wanted us to chat about, and Vincent, I know that you at MHub are looking into how we use technology for development, and that's quite interesting, especially in the African context. And so, in terms of now the internet specifically, would you say higher internet access then means higher development rates? Is there a sort of direct relationship there, or is it subjective? Yeah, I'd like to hear from you.
So there is a direct connection between internet and development in Africa. Actually, there's a research that found out that in most African countries, ICT services contribute about an average of 5% to the GDPs of different countries. So every time that you shut down the internet, there's a possibility that you're losing 5% of the GDP in a country. But to break it down, what it means is that it affects the delivery of critical services in a country. When people cannot access internet, it means that it unsettles maybe supply chains, and it has like systematic effects on the economy. It also erodes like business confidence, and then it raises a very bad or risky country profile. When people see, I can give an example. In Chad, they did not have internet for like 19 months, the period between 2019 and 2020. And everyone else, when they read about what is happening in Chad, they thought which is true, it's an authoritarian state. And then it just added salt to the wound that there's no internet for like 19 months. And then just in 2019 to 2020, we had countries like Zimbabwe, Tunisia, Togo, Burundi, I think Mali, Guinea, and Ethiopia. They all do not have internet. The end result is that it impacts both micro and macro level in terms of the economy. And at the same time, it affects the rights of citizens accessing information, which is very important. I think Rinu and Abiba will agree with me on that. We are being activists in that space. It's a human right now to have access to the internet. And then even government itself struggles to communicate to people when they cut down the internet because they also have to rely on the internet. So yes, there is a connection, a very big one in terms of development and the internet. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that, Vincent. I saw a lot of nodding. It seems everyone's really in agreement with that. And I guess as you were speaking, another thing that was coming to mind, and I think it's come out a bit as everybody else was speaking, was issues to do with now government. When we talk of now rule of law, and Abiba, I'm looking at you as I think of this, because I think that's one of the areas that you have stated you specialize in writing on. And as we're talking about issues of rule of law, can we really say that governments are justified to impose internet shutdowns where they're citing issues like national security and public order? Is there somewhat a justification there?
In general, I'm very disinclined to buy into those arguments because I think part of the things that we have to do as activists in this space is to not make the internet a special category. We should try to be inclusive in terms of how we see the internet and see the efforts of governments to crack down on the internet as part of a continuum in terms of government censoring means of information. So 20 years ago, if the government wanted to shut down, they'll probably close a radio station, a television station, a newspaper. So we have to see the internet as an extension of those same sort of efforts that the government has always tried to do in muzzling down traditional media, right? So if we understand the internet as an extension of what already existed, then it's easier for us to make the argument that we all understand freedom of expression. We all understand freedom of association. So the internet is not some sort of new area that's coming in where those rights don't apply. So the same rights that apply to freedom of expression on television, on radio, is the same rights that should apply to the internet as well. And when governments use the excuse of national security, how come national security is only ever called during election times? So if you look at most of the times that the internet has been shut down on the African continent, it's always in response to a shoddy election or always in response to valid criticisms and protests by the citizens of that country. Nigeria has not quite experienced a full internet shutdown, but many people suspect that during the EndSARS protests, there were attempts to basically play with the internet, right? So we also have to put into your minds that the internet shutdowns are on a continuum. On one extreme end is a complete blackout. On the other end, you have things like throttling, where all of a sudden the internet is so slow you can't even do anything. Or all of a sudden you try to go on a site and that site is no longer accessible, or a newspaper's website has gone offline, right? And then another funny thing that governments do sometimes is immediately after a protest, suddenly they hike the prices of data to make data unaffordable for a large portion of the population. So when you deny them access to the internet because they can't afford it, then you're minimizing, you're reducing the amount of people who could potentially push back, right? So in terms of the rule of law and the internet, if we can always think back that the internet is just an extension of a way for people's voices to be heard, then we can then see that direct link between political and civil rights, such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, and what governments are trying to do. But at the same time, we must accept that in some conditions, it might be justified for governments to restrict the internet, but it has to be under extreme public interest conditions. And for me, one of the conditions would probably be during the Rwandan genocide, where there was a radio station that was basically propagating violence against a minority population in such extreme circumstances. And then very recently in Sri Lanka, when there was a terrorist attack and then the government shut down the internet to prevent disinformation. Even though I'm not necessarily inclined to that exception, but I think it has to be under extreme circumstances where giving the government just enough time to put whatever it is under control, but not legitimate protest by citizens. The only time I want to see any government in Africa, doing a blackout on the internet is if there's a genocide, if there's risk of terrorist activities, like a terrorist that uses the internet to communicate, to come and bomb down the country. So unless the circumstance is that extreme, I don't think it's often justified to, shut down the internet.
For that, and I'd like to extend this question to Reno as well, working in the human rights space, where the internet can also be used as a tool to trump on people's human rights. So how do we then reconcile that, understanding that the internet can can limit human rights, but at the same time can also accelerate human rights?
Your question seems quite. Can you break down the question so that I can answer
Okay.
one after the other? Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, just basing off what Abiba was saying, where well, she was looking more specifically into these extreme circumstances where, okay, the government can maybe shut down the internet for a time. And I was just thinking of you working in the human rights sphere as well. How would you guys approach the internet being abused as well, where it can be used to also abuse certain rights? So how do we then approach that from a human rights perspective without limiting rights as well?
Well, I do not agree that the government should have the right to censor or shut down the internet, because looking at different studies, for example, the 2011 shutdown in Egypt, suggests that once the Egyptian authorities, once they caught access to the internet, then this dispersion of protests and carry increased, and like Abigail, right, Abiba, right, said the other time, why is it that it is during elections or voters' participations that the government often cites national security to shut down the internet? It shows that most of, especially these days, there was this study in Syria that shows that the government used internet shutdown strategically to weaken the opposition. And during these times where governments, they try to shut down internet, you could see a significant increase in the number of killings, in the number of violence, in the number of atrocities that are committed, especially when in Nigeria, like Abiba said, even during the NSAS protests, the government tried to actually shut down the internet. There were moves. There are still talks about social media regulations, that even during the incidents of October 2020, there were reports that the internet actually slowed down at those moments, at those critical moments, which shows that there was a time when we had the Feminist Co funding link pulled down. We had People's Gazette. We couldn't reach strategic sites. The protesters had to reach for information. Why is it that it is when the political structures are being threatened that we have issues of national security? So I do not agree that government should have access to internet shutdown. However, what I think that the government could do is not an ode or an or a shutdown hold. They could reject undue restrictions on access to information and free expression, especially during a pandemic. I mean, in Ethiopia, you have the government shutting down information. How can you shut down the internet at a moment where there's a pandemic, where people actually need critical access to the internet, critical access to information that could save their lives? Inability to access this information at this particular time can heighten the sense of helplessness, anger, frustration. It could put the health of others at risk. Yet, Ethiopian government went ahead to shut down the internet. It's such, an archaic move. What the government can do in this time around is, bolster cyber diplomacy. You could encourage people, lead by example. You do not have to wait for when your political structures are being threatened to shut down the internet. Encourage, preserve broad protections against intermediary liability. There are so many things that the government could do instead of going to shut down the internet. They could ensure that these internet laws and practices are there to international human rights and standards. These are things they could do. It's especially in Africa for us, which is why I think that the government should not have a hold on internet. For us in Africa, it is always about when voting time comes or when people are protesting. That is when government says national security. When it's something that has to do with them, you do not find any issues of national security, like Abiba said. So I think no.
All right, no, thank you so much, Renu. And
can I just clarify something? I'm not for internet shutdowns, but as a lawyer, there's always an exception to every rule, even the rules that we like. And I'm saying that if there should, if the potential even exists for internet shutdowns to happen, they should happen under very extremely limited circumstances, right? So we're not talking about an election is happening and the president is losing and then they shut down the internet. We're talking about
Uganda.
Ugandan genocide, where there was a radio station, just one radio station, that was propagating how people could get machetes to, basically butcher their fellow citizens. Now, that was in 1994. It wasn't the internet, it was a radio station. But like I said, the way we've always dealt with the traditional media, those legal structures are the things that would still apply under an internet situation. So in that circumstance, it was in the national interest to shut down that radio station. But that radio station was never shut down. And in 100 days, 1 million Rwandans were basically butchered by their fellow citizens. So I'm giving very extreme examples. So the Sri Lankan situation with 300 people dead and the government had to shut down certain social media sites so people aren't spreading disinformation. Or in London in 2019, the Travel for London, the underground station, actually shut down the internet underground to prevent protesters who were gathering together to close access to the airports. So under very limited circumstances. And another thing we have to consider is internet.
Sorry, I will have to cut you right there. I'm so sorry. But I definitely do understand your point, and I think you had even been very clear about that in the beginning. And I'd like to just extend the same question to Vincent, but with a bit of a tweak as well, where yes, do you think governments are in some cases justified, but not just that, governments impose this on internet service providers. So Vincent, as you're quite aware of the tech world as well, I'm definitely no expert here, how then can how can these internet service providers respond to this? What can be done? What should be done?
Yeah, so the challenge is, these are African governments that we're talking about. And most of the times they cannot be trusted, even with targeted internet shutdowns. They'll always want to abuse that. They'll always find like gaps in our laws to find a way to push for even total internet shutdown. So this even gives challenge to ISPs, internet service providers in Africa, because definitely they respond to the regulators in those countries, and they're in control of everything. Sometimes the most immediate decision is to follow what government is talking about. For instance, in Uganda, a regulator writes all the internet service providers, and the best thing that they do is to react and then cut down the internet. So there are a couple of things. I think the first thing is to start even before the internet shutdown. So there's always some piece of law that these governments are going to use. So I think the first thing that we can do, internet service providers, all of us, activists, tech people, we need to work together to force national parliaments in African countries to repeal some of these laws. We know there are some bad laws out there that every time there's an incident, governments will make use of that piece of law. I can give you an example. In 2019 in Zimbabwe, when government forced ISPs to cut down the internet, a couple of organizations came together and forced government to rescind that decision through the courts. I think there's MISA Zimbabwe, there is Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. They went to court and they were able to push government back. Of course, government went back and chose another law, and then they still pushed back on internet shutdown. But there's something that we can do. The second part is, as much as we're talking about internet shutdown, there's not always a total internet shutdown. There's no like one gateway to the internet. There'll always be ways of circumventing this total shutdown. I think the most important thing is to equip the society or communities in an event of an internet shutdown. What do you do? We did that in Malawi towards the 2019 elections. I think you made reference to the article that I wrote. We brought together different stakeholders, including ISPs, including academics and activists, to look at ways of how people can monitor the internet. So there are tools like Uni, I think, P-Siphon. You can always use those tools to monitor the internet. And there are a lot of organizations out there that are supporting this cause. I think NetBlocks is one. Access Now is another organization that is also championing that governments should keep internet on. Working with them help us to understand the tools. And every time that we noticed that there was a slowdown in the internet, we would notify people. And then sometimes we make noise, and then we put pressure on the government to know that, oh, internet is going down and people are noticing. And then the other thing is, educating people on how to kind of go back to, I'm trying to find a way of still making sure that the government is accountable in a way, even beyond the internet shutdowns. Even after that, they've shut down the internet, we can still go back and put them to account, even though the issue already happened.
And I am so sorry that we have to wrap up. There's obviously so much that still needs to be talked about. Maybe there's a part 2 needed. I know there's so much to say, and I wish we could go on and on, but yeah, sadly we can't. But thank you all so much. You've been a great panel, and hopefully we can do this again very soon.